Much too often are statements made by professors, European educators, and the like, and even from our own community, made as if Africa is not the foundation of civilization. Okay? What they do is they ignore and try to bury it or put it under the Vatican, put it in museums, all of the accomplishments of African, and they whitewash it. Now, most people will want to deny this, but we know this is true. Thousands of years before Europeans even knew where Africa was, we were thriving. And if you don't believe that not only am I and black people here and all over the world Africans, check your DNA. And I'm talking to the whole world. And see if it doesn't come up part African. Because I'm told, and everybody else knows it by now, and if you don't, then that's a lack of education. I can't help you with that unless you listen. But most people, they already know. And they've been taught by some of the greatest liars in the world. In order to especially set up a system where you are the supreme authority, you have to kill, you have to make people work for free, and you cannot acknowledge their culture, their education, their intelligence, anything about that person, because you're taking everything from him and putting your stamp on it. This is part 2 to President Ibrahim Traore's response and challenge to an Oxford professor who thought that he could get on a stage in front of a whole audience of people and make a statement that wasn't true and wouldn't be challenged by somebody intelligent. Now, please listen, because what this man is saying is true, but people underestimate President Ibrahim Traore. Personally, I think he's a genius. But let's listen.
Surpass modern engineering. The Nubian pyramids predate their Egyptian counterparts. The rock churches of Lalibela were carved from single pieces of volcanic rock with a precision that modern engineers struggle to explain. But perhaps you've never heard of these, because they don't fit your narrative of African primitiveness. The transformation in the room was palpable. Students who had been slouching were now sitting upright, many taking notes. Several professors were nodding along, some looking uncomfortable, others seemingly discovering this information for the first time. Harrington's face had gone from dismissive to defensive to something approaching panic. But Traore wasn't finished. "Let's discuss metallurgy," he continued, his voice now carrying the authority of absolute certainty. The Haya people of Tanzania were producing carbon steel in blast furnaces 2,000 years ago, a technique that wouldn't appear in Europe until the Industrial Revolution. The bronzes of Benin are so sophisticated that, when Europeans first saw them, they refused to believe Africans could have made them. So they invented theories about lost Portuguese craftsmen. Agriculture. Africans domesticated pearl millet, sorghum, African rice, yam, black-eyed peas, watermelon, and okra. They developed complex irrigation systems in the Sahel that sustained cities of hundreds of thousands, while Europe was experiencing the Dark Ages. The terraced agriculture of the Dune people has sustained communities for over 1,000 years in conditions where European farming methods fail within a season. Traore paused, looking directly at Harrington, who was now visibly sweating despite the cool temperature of the theater. But perhaps most importantly, Professor, let's talk about Ubuntu, the philosophical concept that I am because we are. While European philosophy was obsessing over individual rights and conquest, African philosophy was developing concepts of restorative justice, collective responsibility, and human dignity. Concepts the so-called civilized world is only now beginning to understand. The tragedy, Professor Harrington, Traore said, his voice now soft but piercing, is not that Africa contributed nothing to civilization. The tragedy is that scholars like you have spent centuries actively erasing, ignoring, and denigrating those contributions. When the Library of Timbuktu was at its height, housing more books than any European university, your ancestors called us illiterate. When our astronomers were tracking the movements of the stars, you called us superstitious. When our healers were performing complex surgeries, you called us witch doctors. He picked up his folder and pulled out one final document. This, Professor, is a letter from Cecil Rhodes, founder of the scholarship that perhaps funded your education. In it, he explicitly states that African history must be suppressed to justify colonization. Your ignorance isn't accidental, Professor. It's the result of a deliberate, systematic effort to erase African contributions to human civilization, and you've been perpetuating it for 47 years. The silence in the theater was absolute. Harrington stood at the side of the stage, his mouth opening and closing, but no words emerged. Traore wasn't quite finished. I could continue for hours, Professor. I could tell you about the astronomical calculations of the Dune people, who knew about Sirius B centuries before Western telescopes could detect it. I could describe the complex fractal geometry in African art that predates Mandelbrot by centuries. I could explain how the call and response tradition of African music became the foundation for jazz, blues, rock, and virtually every form of popular music. But I think I've made my point, Traore concluded. The question isn't whether Africa contributed to civilization, Traore said. The question is why you, a professor at one of the world's most prestigious universities, don't know any of this. Or worse, he paused, making eye contact with Harrington. Why you know it and choose to deny it. The first clap came from a young African woman in the third row, then another. Within seconds, the entire theater erupted in thunderous applause. Students stood, then professors, then even some of the administrators. But the most remarkable reaction came from an elderly white professor in the front row. Professor Mary Whitfield, head of African Studies, stood and spoke into her microphone. Mr. President, she said, acknowledging Traore's actual title for the first time, as a member of this institution, I apologize. Your words today have exposed a shameful blind spot in our curriculum. I move that Oxford immediately review and revise our history programs to include the African contributions you've outlined. The applause renewed, even louder. Harrington, isolated on the side of the stage, looked around desperately for support, but found none. His decades of authority had evaporated in 10 minutes. When the applause finally died down, Traore spoke once more. I don't seek apologies, he said quietly. I seek truth. And the truth is that human civilization is not the property of any one continent or race. It's the culmination of all human achievement, from the first mathematical calculation on an African bone to the latest scientific discovery. But as long as professors like Dr. Harrington continue to teach a deliberately incomplete history, we perpetuate ignorance and prejudice. Today, in this room, we have a choice: continue the lies, or embrace the full, rich, complex truth.